Thank you, Professor Walls, for the invitation. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be able to be here. And I have to begin by expressing one reason that maybe isn't so obvious. But to me, it's a particular joy to be visiting and speaking at Simon Fraser University because of the role that it played in, I think, one of the more important intellectual figures of our lifetime. Back in the late 60s, early 70s, Ernest Becker, the great existential psychologist, was hounded basically from one university to another in the U.S., and eventually he had to leave the U.S., and he came to Canada. And Vancouver Simon Fraser University welcomed him. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be speaking in the same university. So thank you. Shakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha, lived in India about 2,400 years ago, 2,500 years ago. Nobody knows for sure very exactly when, but we do know that it was Iron Age India. And let me emphasize the Iron Age. Buddhism is, or started as, an Iron Age religion, which is very interesting because that obviously implies the question then, how can the teachings of an Iron Age religion be relevant to the kinds of social problems that we're facing today? Things like the war on terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, economic globalization, biotechnology. What does an Iron Age religion have to say about that? Many people have, over the years, believed that the Buddha was omniscient, but there's no good reason to believe that he knew anything about, say, the genetic code of life, or the structure of the solar system, or the physics of light and electromagnetism, or the theory of relativity, much less things like the internal combustion engine, guns, airplanes, television, nuclear fission, silicon chips, computers, the internet. And he was also unfamiliar with the nation-state system, corporate capitalism, universities, scientific institutes, high-tech warfare, including the atom bomb, United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And he also knew nothing about the modern social sciences like developmental psychology, sociology, and anthropology. So if that's the truth, if that's the case, why do we think that Buddhist social ethics has something important to teach us today when the problems that we have are so much connected with all of those technologies? What did the Buddha know? Well, he knew suffering, human suffering, how it works, what causes it, and how to end it. In fact, he said that that's the one thing he had to teach, suffering and how to end it. Although the English word suffering that we usually use today isn't a very good translation of the original Pali term dukkha. Especially today, when those of us fortunate to live or visit beautiful places like British Columbia have many ways to enjoy ourselves and distract ourselves. The point of the Buddhist term, however, is that even when we are wealthy and healthy, we nonetheless experience a basic dissatisfaction or a basic dis-ease that continually festers. That we find life dissatisfactory, one damn problem after another, isn't accidental or coincidental. It's built into our lives. There's something inherently frustrating about the way our lives work because it's the nature of an unenlightened mind to be bothered by something. There is, as it were, a kind of free-floating anxiety at the core of our being which has no particular object but which can plug into any problematical situation. And although we can try to evade this anxiety by dulling ourselves with alcohol, tobacco or other addictions, television, consumerism, sex, whatever, or we can become workaholic and become preoccupied with the various projects and goals that we're trying to achieve. But according to Buddhism, according to the Buddhist claim of dukkha, that anxiety, that basic dis-ease is still there. And when we slow down enough to become sensitive to what's going on in our minds, then we become aware of it, which is, of course, one reason why we don't like to slow down. The original root of the Pali term dukkha, let me take advantage of the whiteboard here. Dukkha, not suffering, let's call it dis-ease, or as I'll explain in a moment, lack. The original root of the term dukkha, I'm not an etymologist, but this is what I read, evidently refers to a wheel whose axis is a little bit off-center, so that whenever it goes around, there's a little bit of a bump, so that you never get a smooth ride. There's a kind of jerkiness that keeps interfering with ever becoming comfortable. What is this metaphor pointing at? Why is that axis always a little bit off-center? Well, to answer that question, we also have to appreciate the other great Buddhist insight, which is anatta, non-self. And in fact, I would say that that's really what's so distinctive or so unique about Buddhism, is the connection it makes between this basic dissatisfaction in our lives and the fact of anatta, or non-self. Our basic ongoing frustration is tied to the fact that we think, we feel that we are a separate self, a self separate from the world that we are in. So what non-self is really claiming is that the sense of separation, the feeling that David Loy or any of us is a thing, a person, a self, somewhere inside my head, behind the eyes, looking out at the world out there, that basic dualism is also the basic frustration, the basic illusion that is tied to dukkha. That if this is the way we experience the world, if we have the illusion of self, then we're going to experience the world as dukkha. Another way to express this is that our ego self is a construct, a social and psychological construct, that because it is constructed is therefore essentially ungrounded, and it can't be grounded. But we experience this ungroundedness as an emptiness or a hole at the very core of our being, something that's extremely uncomfortable, and therefore we want to sort of keep trying to fill it up one way or another. Now this may sound rather philosophical or abstract, but on the contrary, it's very precise. It's the most concrete issue of all, because it constantly festers, this ungroundedness, this lack of self. It festers because we don't really know what to do about it. We don't really understand what's bothering us. The way we feel it, therefore, is as a vague sense of inadequacy, of unreality, of lack. The feeling that there's something lacking in my life, something wrong with me. And in compensation, we usually spend our lives either dulling ourselves to evade or ignore this uncomfortable feeling, or trying to accomplish things that we think will fill up this void at our core, that we think will make us feel more real. We don't usually realize that the problem is inside us at the very core of our being, because that's so uncomfortable, because we don't know how to deal with it. We usually understand it, we project it, and we understand it as something outside us, that the problem isn't me, the problem isn't the ungroundedness of my sense of self. The problem is that I'm lacking something out here, right? Something out here in the world. For example, in the kind of culture, North American culture that we have, obviously one of the main ways that we become aware of this is, well, it must be that I don't have enough money, or I don't have enough sex, or I'm not famous enough. In the case of academics, professors, we haven't published enough books, or if we have, not enough people are reading them, this sort of thing. And it can go on indefinitely. So what I'm suggesting is that our deepest, worst, most intractable dukkha is this frightening truth that we are not real, that the self is not real, that in some fundamental way each of us is empty, in some sense nothing or no thing at all. And I think it's important for us all to realize that everyone else has the same sense of lack at the core, that everyone else has to cope with the same thing, the same sense of unreality that we do. It's the universal human condition. That's the point. That's the claim, I think, about dukkha. It's also a kind of great unspoken secret, collective secret that we usually hide even from ourselves. Our being a separate self is a delusion because we're not really separate from the world. In fact, we're not really in the world so much as we are a manifestation of it. So David Loy isn't some person or thing or body in the world right here and now, but rather I and all of you, each of you, is what the whole world is doing right here and now. You and I are impermanent, always changing like everything else, part of that great cycle of cause and effect that encompasses everything. This being one way to express the great insight of the Buddha when he became awakened to the true nature of things. Everything arises and passes away according to causes and conditions. Everything is created, everything is constructed, and that includes our awareness, that includes our sense of self, which is always changing. But that's very uncomfortable for us. And so we try to stabilize ourselves. We try to find something to cling to give us security. Unfortunately, as Buddhism emphasizes, everything is impermanent, so there's absolutely no security that can be found in that way. Another way to say it, well, I guess I've already said it, is we're all shadowed by this sense of lack. It really is a kind of a shadow that follows us everywhere we go. Now, what does all this have to do with the social issues, social ethics, which is the announced topic of this talk? Well, don't worry, we're headed in that direction. Here I want to make a jump. And I want to first ask, well, okay, given what I've just said, does that imply then, or doesn't that imply that social problems too might be just projections of our own dissatisfaction? Isn't it the case that if we can just find a way to resolve our sense of lack, like go off in the mountains or the jungle and we meditate and we let go of ourselves and we become awakened, doesn't that mean that everything becomes perfect? We discover that the world is perfect just as it is and we are perfect just as we are? I mean, isn't that what Buddhism is all about? Well, obviously I'm here to argue that that's not the case. Unfortunately, it's not so simple. Yes, to wake up to your true nature in Buddhism is to realize that all human beings have the same Buddha nature, that really we all lack nothing. But since most of us haven't realized that true nature, we are preoccupied with this dukkha, with this sense of lack. And being social beings, what I want to suggest to you is that we also tend to group or to bundle our sense of lack. What I want to do now is make a move from this individual problem, the individual sense of self, over here, the individual sense of self being connected with this sense of lack that we all feel. And I want to make the argument that the same thing is true on a collective group level. That just as there is an individual self, so there's also collective or group selves, group identities. And just as there is individual dukkha, so there is also collective dukkha and collective senses of self. Nope, that's the other side. Collective self. I mean, it's really all about identities, isn't it? I mean, what I've just said about the individual self is the fact that our identity is never fixed. It's never formed. It's always a construct in the process of being reconstructed. It's never secure. And of course, I think you can see pretty quickly that much the same is true with social identities, with the kind of groups that we naturally tend to identify with. The really challenging question, the issue is, can we see that the same thing is true, that there's also a collective sense of lack, that there's also collective dukkha? even as we tend to create collective senses of self, we tend to create collective senses of lack. Because the sense of self and the emptiness of the self isn't only an individual problem, it's also a collective problem. Our group identities have group senses of lack. Let me try to explain. Many, maybe most of our social problems can be traced back also to a deluded sense of collective self or a deluded sense of identity. Our problem isn't only the ego, but what we might call the we-go. The group ego of we, which involves, of course, identifying with one's own race, one's own nation, one's own class, one's own gender, one's own religion, or some combination thereof. Think of the Middle East, where religion and nationality are so much bound up with each other. In each case, what happens? It's really the same process. If the individual self has to do with separating the sense of me, subject inside, from the world outside, the collective self is working the same way, isn't it? We identify as being, well, I'm white, so I distinguish myself from, non-white people, Asians or African Americans. Or I'm male, so I'm distinguishing myself and other males from females, from the other gender. Or the fact that I'm a U.S. citizen, distinguishing that very strongly from people of other nations. In each case, a collective identity is being created and sustained by discriminating one's own group from another group. Again, the same process. The inside, those of us who are inside versus those who are outside. Which, of course, tends to make conflict inevitable. Not only because the groups compete with each other, but because these group identities are socially constructed, which is to say there's something unstable about them, that they're not fixed. The separation between inside and outside is not natural, but something created that must be maintained. And really, there's something fictional about it because of the interdependence. That in order to make the distinction, you're denying the interdependence, the fact that we're all linked and part of each other, which is a basic claim according to Buddhism. This means, therefore, that just as the sense of self, individual self, is always dogged by this feeling of lack, dis-ease. So what I'm trying to suggest to you is that whenever we get caught up in group identity like this, the same thing is happening on a group level. There's also a feeling of anxiety, instability, or if you like, insecurity built into it, into any kind of group identity. Our own group can never feel secure enough. Even as my sense of being an individual self is shadowed by a sense of lack that I can never quite resolve, so a collective sense of self is also haunted by a collective sense of lack or insecurity that, as we know all too well, tends to work itself out aggressively on others. To say it again, usually we understand this lack not as built into the duality, but we understand our uncomfortable feeling as because there's something outside us that's threatening us. There's some problem out there that we have to overcome. And in the case of a collective we-go, it operates in a similar way in that we have the feeling that we are not something enough. We are not whatever. You can put in your own X. In terms of economy, in terms of an economy, our GNP isn't big enough. In terms of military, our military is not secure. We don't have enough security. In terms of technology, we're not technologically developed enough. But if what I'm saying is true about the socially constructed nature of this duality, what that implies, of course, is that trying to solve our economic, military and political, ecological problems with more of the same is not going to be successful. It's going to be a diluted problem. These instances of group lack mean that our GNP can never be big enough, that our military can never be strong enough to give us the kind of security that we want. And we can never have enough technology, which means that if we keep trying to resolve the problem with more of the same, we're just going to make things worse. And to project the source of our problem as over there, as an evil outside us that has to be destroyed, is especially confusing and dangerous, because it's especially denying the sense of interconnectedness with other people. I'll come back to this in a minute when we talk a little bit more about the war on terrorism, which is a classic example. Are you with me so far? I think it's ironic that institutionalized religion tends to reinforce this sense of group self. Because religion at its best encourages us to understand and subvert this kind of deceptive dualism between self and other, including collective self and collective other. According to Buddhist teachings, for example, whether or not you consider yourself Buddhist really isn't very important, because there's nothing salvific in itself about that label, or for that matter about just believing in the Buddhist teachings. What is important is how one realizes and embodies those principles. So, say, a Buddhist bodhisattva doesn't vow to save all other Buddhists. He or she vows to save all sentient beings, not only humans. So there's a kind of denial of that inside and outside. This kind of selfless universalism, or better, non-discrimination, which doesn't involve privileging us over them, this provides the foundation, the basis for Buddhist social ethics and Buddhist social action. But, in some ways, our situation today is very different from that of Shakyamuni, and that's what I want to focus on for the rest of today's talk. Today, we have not only more powerful technologies, but we also have much more powerful institutions. Institutions which not only control those outside them, but those inside them, because the institutions tend to take on a life of their own and subvert the individuals who are working for them. Think of modern school districts, modern transnational corporations, modern military machines. I emphasize the modern because the scale and efficiency of these bureaucracies is distinctively modern, especially now with the quantum leap that we've had from new information technologies. This is what I want to focus on. The special problem of institutions is when they take on a life of their own as new types of we-go, new types of collective ego. So I want to add something new here. What pen shall I use? Let's try a different color. I want to talk about not only collective selves, but institutional selves, emphasizing the fact that institutions can have selves, can become selves, can take on a life of their own. Which therefore raises the very interesting question: if they are collective selves, are they also collective forms of dukkha? Do they have their own institutionalized dukkha, institutionalized lack? That's, as it were, the koan, or the real question for today. What is that? How does that function? How does that bedevil us? And how can we deal with it? Some of the most important and I think often dangerous instances of this today are nation states, transnational corporations, and of course think about their combination with military-industrial complexes. Consider, for example, how a large corporation works. To survive in a competitive market, it has to adapt to the constraints that are built into that market, right? So even if a CEO of a multinational company wants to be socially responsible, he or she is very limited by the expectations of stockholders and consumers and the market. and Wall Street analysts. So if profits are threatened by this new social concern, he or she is likely to lose his job. The reason I make this point is to suggest how we have to understand that in terms of this institutional self, that the institution has taken on a life of its own, and even CEOs have to fit into that. Even those who should have the most power over the institution, they have to fit into that, because if they don't, they're out, and somebody who does fit in will be in their place. Obviously, I haven't spoken enough about this, but as we go on, I'll try to flesh this out. What I'd now like to do is try to make all this a little more concrete, try to unpack it, and ground the connection between dukkha and collective selves, especially institutional selves, by talking about what Buddhism calls the three roots of evil, or sometimes the three poisons. If you want to understand how this acts out, how this dukkha from non-self works itself out on a daily level, it's very helpful to look at the three roots of evil. In contrast to the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism doesn't emphasize evil itself. Rather, it focuses more on the duality between delusion or ignorance and wisdom. In order to help us move from delusion to wisdom, Buddhism distinguishes between our wholesome and our unwholesome tendencies, or traits. Now, the Buddha himself never said, as far as I know, that, human nature is basically good or human nature is basically bad. He didn't talk in those terms. What he did say is that we all have clusters of traits, and some of them are wholesome, and some of them are unwholesome. And the whole point is to develop the wholesome traits and to minimize and get rid of the unwholesome ones. Because when we act according to the unwholesome traits, we create negative karma that creates dukkha. That's the link. And the three classic unwholesome traits, and this is sometimes given as the basic definition of Buddhism, are greed, ill will, and delusion or ignorance. To say it again, when our acts are motivated by these, when these are our intentions or motivations, then what we do tends to create negative effects, what we call bad karma. And it tends to create suffering, of course, not only for ourselves, but for those around us. And one way to understand the basic teaching of Buddhism is that we have to transform these into their more positive correlates. We have to change greed into generosity. So we have to work on letting go of our greed and emphasizing our generosity, which naturally is connected with realizing more the non-duality between ourselves and others. The reason for being generous ultimately is that we're not separate from other people. Same thing, we have to develop our ill will into loving kindness or compassion, except loving kindness is bigger. And we have to develop our delusion into wisdom, especially the wisdom that realizes our interconnectedness. The wisdom realizing our own non-self, because we are really manifestations of everyone and everything else, that we're so completely interdependent that we're actually part of each other, unavoidably, inescapably. Now, the important question, I think, maybe the most important question for engaged Buddhism today is something like this. Okay, we've seen, I've just sketched out a little basic understanding of Buddhism on the individual level. The next question, which you've already guessed, I imagine, is, okay, if this is true on the individual level, is it also true on the institutional level? Do the three roots of evil operate collectively as well? Is there also such a thing as collective, institutionalized greed, which has taken on a life of its own? Is there also collective, institutionalized ill will? Is there also collective, institutionalized delusion or ignorance? And that's what I would like to reflect upon for most of what I still have to say today. I'd like to look at some of the major examples, maybe the major examples of institutionalized greed, institutionalized ill will, and institutionalized delusion. What is institutionalized greed? Despite all the advantages that we're familiar with and grateful for, our present economic system institutionalizes greed in at least two ways. First of all, corporations are never profitable enough or big enough, and consumers never consume enough. To increase profits, we must be conditioned into thinking of ourselves as consumers who find the meaning of our lives in buying and consuming. Contrary to what we are repeatedly told, however, this kind of economic system is neither natural nor inevitable. It's based on one particularly historically conditioned worldview which commodifies the earth into resources, human beings into labor, and money into capital that can be used to make more capital. Everything else becomes a means to the end of profit, which becomes the source of more capital, further expansion. This is the tendency of the system. The process becomes circular, self-reinforcing. It can have no end except more growth, more profit, more and more of the same thing. In other words, I'm suggesting to you that in this fashion, greed today has become collective and institutionalized. Consider how the stock market works. With few exceptions, it tends to function as a kind of ethical black hole that dilutes and anonymizes any responsibility for the actual consequences of the collective greed that now fuels economic growth. I mean, on the one side of that black hole, you have investors who want increased returns from dividends and higher stock prices. And that's all that most of them care about or need to care about. Not because investors are bad people in any way, but simply because the system doesn't encourage any other kind of responsibility. That's what the market is for. On the other side of that black hole, however, this anonymous expectation of increased returns translates into a generalized, impersonal pressure for profitability and growth, preferably in the short run. And however well-intended anyone in that process may be, for example, CEOs, if they're unable to meet the demand, if they're unable to play their role in this system, they're liable to lose their jobs. And today, the globalization of market capitalism means that this emphasis on profit and capital growth are becoming increasingly important as the engine of all the world's economic activity. Everything else, including the environment, human communities, and the quality of life, tends to be subordinated to this anonymous demand for ever more profit and growth. A goal that is never satisfied because it can never be satisfied. Remember dukkha? Remember lack? I think there's a basic lack built into this institutionalized greed. The way that lack functions is that it's never big enough. You never have enough. If you're an investor, you never have enough profits. If you're a consumer, you're never consuming enough. That's the way the lack is built into the system. But from a Buddhist standpoint, it is a form of institutionalized greed. Who's responsible for this pressure for growth? Well, that's my point. The system has attained a life of its own. We all participate in this process. As workers, employers, consumers, investors, pensioners, yet we have little or no personal sense of moral responsibility for what happens as a result of this pressure for growth. Because any awareness has been diffused so completely that it's lost in the impersonal anonymity of the corporate economic system. If the market is simply the most efficient way to meet our economic needs, why do we have such huge advertising and public relations industries? Because, as we really know, they're necessary to create the demand, create the consumption. For a long time now, we've more or less solved the problem technologically, how to make things. The real challenge is how to motivate consumers to want to consume them. How to motivate consumers constantly to believe that they don't have enough, that it's the next thing that they buy that's going to make them happy. And of course, it's always the next thing. It's never what you have now. Economic theory, like the market itself, makes no distinction between genuine needs and the most questionable manufactured desires. It makes no difference why you want something according to the market or economic theory. But the consequences do make a great difference when we consider what this overconsumption has done, for example, to the Earth's resources. The pattern of consumption or overconsumption that seems natural to us today is connected to the rapid deterioration of the ecosphere over the last half-century. I don't know if you know the statistic, but the World Watch Institute estimated that between 1950 and 1990, more goods and services were consumed by the people living then than in all of previous recorded history. I mean, that's almost inconceivable, and I don't know how you measure something like that, but we get the point. Shopping has become our great national North American pastime, or perhaps we should say addiction. But the final irony, of course, is that this commodification, all of this process doesn't really deliver the goods in the sense that it doesn't really give us what we're looking for, which is an end to dukkha. And according to this system, of course, it can't. Comparative studies have shown that huge, massive increases in consumption level don't lead to any significant difference in self-reported happiness. That's the irony. According to the 1999 United Nations Human Development Report, the number of Americans, excuse my south of the border stats here, but the number of Americans who considered themselves happy peaked in 1957. Although consumption has much more than doubled since then. Meanwhile, studies of human households have shown that the income that people want to fulfill their expectations doubled. What they want doubled just within 8 years, between 1986 and 1994. The fact that we're now consuming so much more doesn't seem to be making us any happier. But the fact that we want to consume so much more does seem to be making us less happy. Again, dukkha. Once you get this kind of institutionalized greed, it doesn't resolve dukkha. It's part of the problem, not the solution. Okay, enough on institutionalized greed. What about ill will? The second root of evil. What is institutionalized ill will? Well, the best example, of course, is collective aggression. Militarism. We live in a highly militarized, increasingly militarized world. And unfortunately, the horrible crimes on September 11th, 2001, merely aggravated those militaristic tendencies that were already very strong in the U.S. at least. Yesterday in the newspaper, I noticed that the new military budget for the next fiscal year is now projected at over $419 billion. $419 billion. But when you add the defense portion of the proposed emergency supplemental budget in the U.S., it's going to be almost $500 billion, which, needless to say, perhaps, is much larger than the amount spent on military by all the rest of the world. The U.S. is spending more on its military than all the rest of the world put together, by far, at this point. The Pentagon expects to spend up to or even more than $5 trillion then over the next decade. $5 trillion. That's almost an inconceivable amount. How long is a trillion seconds? Does anyone have an idea? 1 trillion seconds. How many years is 1 trillion seconds? Anybody want to guess? Please help me out here. Just 1 trillion seconds, how much is that? Sorry? Sorry. Not enough. Well, I actually didn't work it out myself. I'm taking somebody's word for this, but 34,000 years. So, I mean, that's before any civilization as we know it. That's 1 trillion. But the Pentagon is going to spend, just in the next 10 years, probably over $5 trillion to secure well, at least that's the argument, right? Now think, of course, if even a tenth of that or less was spent on genuine foreign aid, it would enable every human being in the planet to have access to decent food, water, housing, education, medical care. Every human being in the planet. And of course that would diffuse virtually all military threats as well. Serious possibility because unfortunately the militarism here isn't just aggression, but it's tied, as often happens, these work together, and the aggression is tied to institutionalized greed. The issue isn't just military security, it's economic control of the global resources for the U.S. If not colonialism, neo-colonialism, neo-empire, and especially now, of course, control of oil. Contrary to what we're told, the Star Wars missile defense system is another example of this. I don't know if you followed it, but, you know, every year or so we hear some report that there's been they shoot up a missile and almost always it doesn't work. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to work. That's not the point of it. It's not a Star Wars defense system at all. It's an attempt, the true goal of the program isn't defensive but offensive. It's to militarize space. It's to establish a network of satellites that will enable the U.S. to control anything going on anywhere on the Earth's surface. So, but then when you tie this into the, say, the control of the military-industrial complex and the way that this never is big enough, is never profitable enough, we can see how this system, too, has taken on a life of its own. That what we have now in this militarization of the planet, by my own country, is institutionalized collective ill will. But what about the war on terrorism? I mean, surely we have to take that very seriously, right? Obviously, those Muslim terrorist crazies want to kill us all, so we have to kill them first, right? Well, let me briefly just take another look. Let's take another look at the war on terrorism from a Buddhist perspective, critiquing, the second root of evil. Right after the September attacks, President Bush declared that the U.S. has been called upon for a new worldwide mission, quote, to rid the world of evil and evildoers. Well, certainly if anything is evil, those terrorist attacks were evil. But I think we need to take a much closer look at that rhetoric, because when Bush said he wanted to rid the world of evil, I think alarm bells should go off in our mind, because that's also what Hitler and Stalin were trying to do. What was the problem with the Jews that required a final solution? The earth could be made pure only by exterminating the Jews, the evil, the gypsies, the homosexuals, etc., all the impure vermin who contaminate it. Stalin needed to exterminate the kulaks, the well-to-do peasants, in order to establish his good, perfect society of collective farmers. Both of these great villains, what were they trying to do? They were trying to perfect the world by eliminating its impurities. The world can be made good only by destroying its evil elements. In other words, one of the main causes of evil in the world has been human attempts to eradicate evil, or what we have perceived as evil. In more Buddhist terms, a lot of the world's suffering can be traced back to our ways of thinking about good and evil, about the necessity for good to destroy evil. This dualism between good and evil is very attractive because it's a very simple, easy way of looking at the world. Of course, it's difficult to turn the other cheek when the world is viewed in this way, because it rationalizes the opposite principle, an eye for an eye. But if the world is a battleground of good and evil forces, then the evil that is in the world must be fought and defeated by any means necessary, right? I mean, that's built into the duality. Once you label something as evil, then the only thing to do after that, you don't want to understand it, you don't want to dialogue with it. What you really want to do is destroy it, because it is evil once it's labeled. The basic problem with this way of thinking, however, is that because it precludes further thought, it keeps us from looking deeper, from trying to understand causes. Bush and bin Laden both seem to share this tendency, and I think this is where we can benefit from a Buddhist perspective. Let's go back a bit to Buddhist enlightenment, to Buddhist awakening, which is what the word Buddha means, the awakened one. To be awakened, we have to become more mindful of how our minds work. And Buddhism, to encourage this, encourages us to become aware of the problem of dualistic concepts, antithetical thinking. Not only good and evil, but pure, impure, success and failure, rich and poor. What we usually do, we distinguish between these two because we want one and we don't want the other, right? Like I want to be wealthy, I don't want to be poor. But interestingly, both logically and psychologically, that doesn't work because it's the nature of dualism that you can't take one without the other. That once you start thinking in that way, you're trapped within the whole dualism. That's why these dualities are so problematical for us. For example, suppose you just want to be pure, whatever that means to you. You don't want to be impure. But if you want to be pure, what that means is that you're going to be preoccupied with impurity because you're always going to be looking for impurity that you have to avoid. Because the meaning of pure is only the negation of impure, right? The meaning, in order to have the one, you've got to have the both. If you want to be wealthy, it means you're going to be worried. If it's really, really important for you to be wealthy, it means that you are just as concerned about avoiding poverty. And it means that when you walk down the street, you're going to see wealthy people, you're going to notice them, you want to be like that, and you're also going to see the poor, and there's going to be a kind of a, I don't want to be like that. So it involves a spectacles, a pair of spectacles that interferes with the way that we perceive the world. When we're caught up in this dualistic way of thinking, we're not free. Now the issue, of course, in the case of ill will or the war on terrorism, is how does this duality chain us? How does this delude us, cause problems for us with the war on good and evil, the war on terrorism? I think the most important way it works is that the interdependence of good and evil shows itself that we don't know what's good until we know what's evil, and so we have to find an evil if we want to be good. Right? We don't feel good unless we're fighting against that evil. If I want to feel that I'm the good guy, then I'm going to have to find a bad somewhere outside me, preferably outside me. I don't want it inside me. That's too complicated. It's got to be outside. And if it's outside me, then I can fight against it as something external, as something objective to me. We can feel comfortable and secure in our own goodness only by attacking and destroying the evil outside us. St. George needs that dragon in order to be St. George. I'm not referring to my president now, but the old St. George of the Christian medieval, I think it was in England, wasn't it? He needed that dragon. How's he going to be a saint otherwise if he doesn't destroy that dragon? His heroic identity requires it, just as for George Bush too. I think his heroic identity has become so tied up with Al-Qaeda. The best thing that ever happened to George Bush, sadly, was September 11th, right? It gave him mission. It made him a hero, whereas his presidency was going nowhere before that. Well, I think we can understand that in these terms. And sad to say, but true, that's also why we like wars. Wars cut through the problems of everyday life. They unite us, good guys here, against the bad guys over there. Now the problems are over there. Those are the bad guys. Those are the evil ones trying to kill us. So we feel bonded together. Our identity. We have a healthy identity. There's fear in that, of course, but there's also something very exhilarating. The meaning of our life becomes clear. The problems with my life and your life, our life, they're over there, those guys trying to hurt us. Very simple. The truth is, we all love this struggle between good and evil because it is in its own fashion quite satisfying. It makes sense of the world. The world is very messy. It's complicated, confusing. We don't know how to live. We don't know what's right, what's wrong. And this whole way of thinking about good and evil solves it all for us. And of course, we're surrounded by things that encourage us to think this way. Think of the plot of every James Bond film, every Star Wars film, Indiana Jones film. I realize I'm dating myself a bit here, but I guess we can add Lord of the Rings to that, although I love the trilogy. But in all of these, the bad guys are caricatures. They're ruthless, maniacal, without remorse, so they must be stopped by any means necessary. We're meant to feel that it's okay, and to tell the truth, it's pleasurable to see the violence that's inflicted upon them. Because villains like to hurt people, it's okay to hurt them. Because they like to kill people, it's okay to kill them. After all, they are evil, and evil must be destroyed. But what's this story really teaching us? That if you want to hurt someone, it's important to demonize them first, to fit them into your good versus evil story. Even school bullies usually begin by looking for some petty offense, often a perceived insult. You know, the bully, you did something to hurt him, so you deserve getting beaten up by the bully, right? That's why the first casualty of all wars is truth. The media have to sell this script, this story to the people. And the failure of the U.S. media certainly is that it contributed to that with the second Iraq War. For Buddhism, realizing our interdependence and mutual responsibility to each other involves something much more than just intellectual awareness. It involves a different mode of living in the world, which Buddhist texts emphasize by talking about compassion, loving kindness, generosity, all of them reflecting what is really a different mode of being, which we don't really have a very good word for, but the best we have in English is something like love. Love is usually mocked as weak and ineffectual, but it can be very powerful, as Gandhi showed, because it embodies a deep wisdom about how the cycle of hatred and violence works and how the cycle can be ended. An eye for an eye, as Gandhi said, makes the whole world blind, but there is an alternative. And it's interesting, even 2,400 years ago, Shakyamuni Buddha was very clear on this. He said, in this world, hatred is never appeased by ill will. Hatred is always appeased by non-ill will. The basic idea is something compassion, generosity, love, really. And then he said, this is an ancient law. That's quite striking. 2,400 years ago, it was an ancient law that violence, ill will, hatred is never appeased by ill will. Unfortunately, today, I think we need that law more than ever, but we all seem to have forgotten it. The present Dalai Lama emphasizes the necessity for internal disarmament. That's a beautiful phrase, isn't it? Internal disarmament. Disarming ourselves. Greed, ill will, and delusion in the minds of everyone involved, starting with ourselves. It's just not possible to work toward genuine peace in a confrontational, antagonistic way deluded by this duality between good and evil. My time is getting on, but we started a bit late, so can I have another 5 minutes, Jan? And what do you think? Is there enough to talk about? Is it okay? I just want to finish it by talking about institutionalized delusion, and then we can have a discussion, if you like. We've already talked a little bit about this one. If anyone has to go, please don't hesitate. In fact, this is a good break time. To repeat what I've already said, the most fundamental delusion, both individually and collectively, is this sense of self-other duality. that I am inside and the world is outside me. And therefore we usually get preoccupied with sort of getting what we can from the world to give us what we think we need. Or collective selves. Huh? Same thing. We are inside, we are the good guys, and the rest of the world is outside us. Nationalism, of course, is one of the most powerful institutional versions of this group, we-go self. So, of course, there's the basic duality between Homo sapiens sapiens and the rest of the biosphere, which is why we feel so free to use and abuse nature technologically with so little regard for the consequences of this abuse to other species. And of course, our non-duality with nature, the fact that we're interdependent with it, part of it, means that when we destroy something in nature, we're destroying ourselves. And it's becoming more and more obvious that that's exactly what's happening. But there are many aspects to institutionalized delusion. One of them, you can say, is simply an extraordinary level of ignorance about basic history, geography, and science. I'm still puzzled, I'm still amazed that in the United States, for example, 3 times as many people believe in Satan and the virgin birth as in evolution. It's difficult to avoid concluding that the function of schools is no longer education in any broad sense of the word, but job training skills and indoctrination into consumerist values, accompanied usually by patriotic myths of superior nationalist virtues. And since the major media are profit-making institutions, again, let's make the link between institutionalized greed and institutionalized delusion. The major media, at least in the U.S., I don't know enough about Canada, being profit-making, their bottom line is advertising revenue, and they're going to do whatever they need to maximize that profit. So instead of news, you get infotainment, and molding public opinion into a very narrow band of acceptable views. And it's never, of course, in their interest to challenge the grip of consumerism. The programs they offer are the bait, advertisements are the hook, and we are the fish. But if we understand this third collective problem as institutionalized ignorance or ignorance, it helps us to see that modern life in all the developed or economized nations is organized in a way that works to conceal the dukkha that it causes. The system inflicts dukkha on all of us, but most of all on people whom we don't see and therefore don't usually need to think about. Thanks to clever my son and I dare say most of the rest of us here, are encouraged to live in a self-enclosed, ignorant cocoon of hedonistic consumption, which is, of course, an ignorance also perpetuated on the production side, as we saw. We already noticed that the stock market is a kind of ethical black hole. Investors can pore over the financial data provided by stock analysts without ever becoming aware of the ethical impact of the companies that they invest in. If it's only the bottom line, you don't have to think about that. So the cumulative effect of this ignorance is a collective we-go, largely unaware of and indifferent to what's going on in the rest of the world. And why should we be interested in what's going on in the rest of the world? Our society is the cutting edge of civilization progress, right? The center of the universe. Our culture, or perhaps it's just our entertainment industry, is more successful than anyone else's, and so forth. But all this self-preoccupation would be more amusing if it weren't so complicit with so much social dukkha. The problem, quite simply, is that our consumerist lifestyle here in Canada as well as in Japan, where I live, and also in the U.S., depends on a global web of unjust social relationships and destructive ecological impacts. And the ultimate irony of it all, as we've already noticed, of course, is that no matter how much money, how much we may consume, consumerism is ultimately boring and dispiriting. It doesn't address dukkha. So, to sum up, what I've been trying to do is to argue that realizing the nature of these 3 institutional poisons institutionalized greed, which I think is basically our economic system, institutionalized ill will of militarism, and how that's really deforming the consciousness of all of us, and the institutionalized delusion of the media, education systems, and the way that we're encouraged not to be aware. What I want to suggest to the Buddhists in the audience is that waking up to the truth of these three institutionalized poisons is just as important as any individual awakening that we may have on our own cushions. Our own individual enlightenment must be supplemented by a social enlightenment that becomes aware and sensitive to these concerns. In both cases, what's needed is a greater awareness that goes beyond the limitations of ego awareness or we-go awareness. Usually we think of expanded consciousness in individual terms, but today we must penetrate through the veil of social delusion to attain greater understanding of dualistic social, economic, and ecological realities. So what I'm really saying is that if this parallel holds, if this is true, then it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that the social challenges we face today, the great social, economic, and ecological crises of our day, are also spiritual challenges, which therefore call for a response that must also be in part spiritual. I've used up some of my time, so I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Now it's our turn. Usually I think it's a good idea to begin the dialogue or question and answer series starting with questions of understanding, in other words, good. If you have a question of in the nature of, did I understand you correctly, as saying this, you get those out of the way, and then we get into substantive ones we're sure that we understand it correctly.
I'm wondering if you see a difference between self and identity. And what do you mean when you appear to be differentiating? On one level, you appear to be differentiating between the concept of self and the concept of an identity. On another level, you appear to be doing not differentiating, but rather suggesting that they're interrelated or connected, which obviously they may be. But I wonder if you could just expand a bit on what you are saying when you were talking about identity.
Right. I didn't mean to make a hard distinction there. I think there's a certain ambiguity that tends to be built into discussions of non-self, because on the one hand we're saying there's no self, and yet, well, I have a sense of self, right? So what is that? Where does that come from? So what I was trying to emphasize is that I think a clear way to understand it is the understanding both the individual and the collective self as constructed.
Right.
I mean, the self is always constructed and it's always being reconstructed, and there's a basic insecurity because it can never attain the kind of stability. And so you can say exactly the same thing about identity, that our identities are constructed and never secure and never grounded.
The interesting thing politically, when you start talking about institutionalized the institutionalization of the concepts that you've described, is that politically, identity politics has been an identifier, if you will, of progressive politics. We've just been through in the 70s and 80s the expression of identity politics, and in fact we're still having that argument internally, I think, many of us, as to how do we reconcile our identities as women, as feminists, very much. And so I'm struggling within that context. I'm trying to figure out how to express non-self, non-self, at the same time as being true to my identity. So I was very interested in because it's the first time I've actually heard in the context of this kind of within the Buddhist framework, the notion of identity. Suddenly it's okay, now I see something completely different. So,
well, as you notice, this isn't a very gendered analysis, but to more nuanced. We all have, as we say in Buddhism, form is emptiness, but emptiness is form. The idea isn't to get rid of the self or all identity completely. Even if that were possible, what would it be? It would be a kind of insanity. But to realize the permeability or the constructiveness of our identity. The idea isn't to get rid of identity, but to realize how the identities are formed and the ways that by fixating upon them, we get caught up in the kinds of problems that I've been talking about.
I like the idea of
We need self. We need sense of self to function. The idea isn't to get rid of it, but it's to realize that it's empty. That's one way to say it. And then we're not so trapped by it. And I think the same thing would be true generally for identity politics and more generally.
Thank you.
It's a good start. Any more questions, comments?
I'm trying to understand, you use the word evil, and then you have greed, generosity, ill will, loving kindness, delusion, wisdom, and yet you were saying that with the trap of duality, identifying evil, then there has to be, you want to feel good, so you've got to find what's evil. So how do these Buddhist ideas avoid the trap of duality?
Does it help at all if because I use the word evil here, I'm using it in several different senses.
Yeah.
Right. Well, maybe we should get rid of it and talk about unwholesome tendencies or sweet poison.
Okay.
The word evil there really isn't necessary. The reason I was using it is, it's found in the Buddhist text, but also it's to emphasize the roots, the causes that create evil. And evil here is really understood, I think, in the sense of dukkha. These are the roots that cause bad karma and that cause dukkha.
But then you still have these dualities, which are they not? Would you not? Is not greed?
These dualities?
Yeah.
You can call them dualities if you want, but I don't think they're dualities of the sort, the kind of dualistic thinking. For example, maybe they are. For any kind of spiritual transformation, we have to make distinctions. In Buddhism, there's a kind of a nice edge. There's a paradox of we need to realize that we're perfect just as we are, that we don't lack anything, that the sense of lack is because of groundness, and that there's not really a lack. At the same time, in order to realize that, one may have to engage in all kinds of strenuous practices. So there's a tension between the means and the ends that often, I think unavoidably in religion, you still have to make some kind of distinctions between means and ends, between where you are now, which is problematical, and where you're trying to get to. So in that sense, I think the kind of duality is unavoidable. If the problem, what I'm worried about is, what I think is important though is to realize spiritually is that the process is going on inside us. It's not that I'm going to be good by destroying the evil outside me, but that this is most of all an internal struggle. And curiously, in Islam too, the original meaning of jihad, it was understood the important jihad, the main jihad, was the internal jihad, dealing with your own problems rather than understanding it as a battle in the external world. So to that extent, I think the important difference is being aware that all of these dualities are things that we have to struggle with inside ourselves in terms of our own unwholesome and unwholesome traits. The duality becomes a problem when I want to be good and I project the evil out there, when it gets tied up in that separation between good and evil.
Well, you can also create a duality inside yourself of hating yourself for being greedy and hating yourself for, I appreciate the wisdom of these ideas, but at the same time, I can't see beyond whether it's internally you're experiencing duality, because I think that can create problems just as much as it's projecting them outwards. So I just not see how you get away from it.
Well, you can understand the problems within yourself as something to get very depressed and neurotic about, or you can see them as the places where you need to grow. The Dalai Lama has mentioned many times that he's so struck that Westerners have this incredibly low self-opinion. They have all these problems with self-esteem, very low opinions of themselves, which evidently doesn't seem to be a big problem in Tibet. So maybe it has some connection with our stronger sense of individualism, our stronger sense of self. I agree completely with what you said, but that's not.
Yeah.
Insofar as that's happening, that's part of the problem that has to be dealt with.
Right.
And why sometimes spiritual practice needs to be supplemented with sometimes a bit of psychological counseling to help avoid the practice feeding into that kind of neurotic way of thinking.
Right.
We had a hand up over there, and then I don't know if you.
Yeah, I found very, very interesting and useful this exporting of the individual, the application of the principles from the individual to the collective, and then exporting that to the institutional. When you were talking, I was trying to think of how the two were different, and I wasn't sure if you had articulated, in fact, a clear difference between the collective and the institutional. And if you have, then I must have just glossed over that while I was focusing on something else. But it occurred to me that the collective was kind of a bottom-up, whereas the institutional was a kind of a top-down. And one was a kind of an emergent thing, whereas the other was a kind of a constructed or imposed. But maybe that's just my thinking, and this is your idea, which I like. So can you clarify, expand on the difference between the collective and the institutional?
I hadn't been thinking about it in those terms, but that makes some sense.
Well, you distinguish between them. I'm trying to figure out
between collective and institutional.
Yeah, very, very. For my mind, I think very useful because there's a real important difference. But I wasn't sure if I was just imposing my own idea on something a different idea, or should we do distinguishing it?
Right. I guess I was thinking of collective identities as larger, and sort of institutions. Institutions as certain examples, but that not all collective identities would involve institutions in the same way. But that's as far as I've taken it. So, it's because I was really trying to focus in the talk on the institutional.
Institutional identities are a subset of a collective. Because that's what your diagram would suggest.
Do you want to critique it or suggest?
I'm just asking, is that what you're trying to?
Well, I mean, there are larger collective identities: gender, race, and so forth, which are quite large. And obviously, we have more than one collective identity. There's a whole cluster. But what's peculiar? What's special about the institution?
I want to argue against the subset theory very quickly that you go on. It's interesting. And that is, think that I could belong to one collective group here, you could belong to another collective group. And yet, we might join together in an institutional format that has nothing to do with our collective identities. And therefore, it's a separate thing, an animal by itself.
Yeah.
So it appears like it might be a subset, but yet it's really not. It's a separate animal. That's my feeling.
Or a different type of collectivity.
Not necessarily a subset.
Yeah. No, I think I agree with that. Yeah.
But what I really want to emphasize is that we become sensitive to the fact of how they take on a life of their own, and how we become sucked into them, and they really control us. And I think that's what's really scary when you see them in those terms.
Because they operate, as I said, they operate differently. Not just the subsets that operate in similar ways, they have two different ways of compelling the point.
Thank you.
No? Any other questions, comments, please?
When we look at dukkha and anatta, it seems that dukkha arises because we have a strong sense of self. So we experience understand there is no self, then the dukkha, we don't experience dukkha. And that's through the process of different techniques that have arisen in the Buddhist tradition. What I'm interested in finding out is, when we have an institution, how do we make the institution understand the idea of non-self? And is that also a parallel that you're getting at, as the Ajuri's parallel? In other words, is it the same medicine?
Which is about experience, not concept.
That's tough.
I only had time to talk about the first two noble truths, right? And you all know the Four Noble Truths: dukkha, cause of dukkha, end of dukkha, and the path. And even then, I really simplified dukkha very much. Just to say a word about that. Dukkha is much more complicated, but what I did was pick out, I think, the most essential. I mean, dukkha is physical, which just involves having a body. It's also it's connected with transient. But what I was emphasizing is what's called the third type of dukkha, which is connected with the sense of self. So dukkha is really much more complicated, and I just sort of simplified it. And the basic emphasis in Buddhism is you can't get rid of all dukkha insofar as you have a body, but you don't. But by understanding how your mind and how your life works, you can make sure that you don't put a second half and make it worse by worrying about this kind of sense of lack. I didn't have anything to say about the solution. I did have a few more pages here, but I'm still maybe Jan will have to invite me back to talk on the third and fourth social truths. By this time, I hope I can work it out a little better.
Is this a segue to talk about the Buddhist Peace Fellowship?
It could be.
Since it's 3:30 and some people might leave, of course, all over the world, there are people who are working at individual levels and community and institutional levels creatively to find another way to live with each other in the world. And one organization that, particularly in the States, is working to bring people who are Buddhist practitioners together to support each other to work in socially engaged Buddhism is the Buddhist Peace Fellowship. A number of us have started a chapter in Vancouver. I've been working on starting a chapter in the past year, and we're having a day-long gathering this Saturday. That's short notice, but if you are interested to look at how this chapter is going to function and what are some directions we might go in Vancouver with Engaged Buddhism. So please help yourself to one of those flyers if you're interested, and speak to any of these people whose hands are raised.
So here's the fourth noble truth. This is how some Buddhists are working together, especially in the U.S., but also now obviously in Canada, to work toward resolving some sorts of these issues. Just if I can add one more point, and because time is going on, I know, excuse the self-plug, but most of the things that in fact maybe all the things that I was talking about today are discussed rather more carefully in this book. So if you want to follow it up, it's called The Great Awakening from Wisdom. And the first chapter especially has a lot of this, and then it has individual chapters dealing with corporations and so forth. So there's an opportunity. But I don't want to cut off discussion, especially because some people, well, what do you think, Jan? I mean, I have time. I don't know if other people have time. Maybe one idea is to have a little break so that those who need to go can do so, and those who want to stay, if you just want to cluster together, we can talk a little bit more together. Should we try that?
Yeah, we can do that. First of all, let me I have a little non-gift. The non-meaningful expression or ingratitude. Don't step on my face. Can Asian values contribute? And this will be next Tuesday, April the 5th, and will be given by old colleague of ours here for many, many